Hi, I'm Femi OK and you're in the stream. Today, doctors and CIA torture. What role should medical professionals have in counterterrorism? He's filling in for Malika Bilal. Our digital producer Omar Badai is waiting for your comments. We are looking at a very specific angle of the CIA so-called torture report. We're looking at the medical aspect of it. What are you seeing online?
And it's an aspect that really hit a nerve with our community. You know, right on the heels of the report, we highlighted something. If you take a look at my screen, you can find this at stream.aljazeera.com. This is Dr. Atul Gawande. He is a medical professor at Harvard Medical School, and he was tweeting immediately on the heels of that report, complaining about the medical aspect specifically. One of his tweets says, "The worst part for me was to see the details of how doctors, psychologists, and others sworn to aid human beings made this torture possible." And that article was shared more than 11,000 times.
Wow.
And our community really wants to have this conversation. This conversation is ongoing, and you can still join it by using the hashtag AJStream, and we'll try to get to those tweets during the show.
Now, joining us in the studio, we have Steve Xenakis, and Steve is a psychiatrist and a retired U.S. Army Medical Corps officer. Stephen, it's great to have you here, and we'll hear a lot more from you in just a moment. A little bit of background, though, first for our international audience. We expect doctors and nurses to take care of us, but the U.S. Senate's so-called torture report paints a very different picture, where medical professionals help the CIA develop, oversee, and at times carry out harsh interrogations. Now, those methods included waterboarding, sleep deprivation, and other forms of physical and mental abuse, all used in an attempt to gather information on future Al-Qaeda attacks on the US. Some doctors say aiding interrogations, even those not involving torture, defies their professional oath to do no harm. But others argue that using scientific knowledge for interrogation could save American lives. So, should doctors have a role in counterterrorism and torture? With us to talk about this, we have in Florida, Mark Fallon. He's a former interrogator and deputy assistant for counterterrorism with the U.S. Naval Criminal Investigative Service. In New York, Stephen Reisner is a psychologist and co-founder of the Coalition for Ethical Psychology. And in Connecticut, we have Nathaniel Raymond, a human rights investigator with the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. Gentlemen, it's great to have you all here in this discussion. Nathaniel, let me just start with you first of all. The extent of breaking ethics or medical ethics, as far as we know from this torture report, what kind of violations actually happened?
Oh, where to begin? Basically, the involvement of health professionals, both physicians and psychologists, violated every single piece of domestic and international law that the torture did, but it also involved the committal, it appears, of a second crime of alleged human subject research. And that, combined with the ethical violations of licensure and international declaration and treaty, including the Declaration of Helsinki, Declaration of Tokyo, the list goes on, means that health professionals in their engagement in this program actually violated more laws and ethics than the other personnel involved.
So give us an example.
A simple example would be from the Physicians for Human Rights report, Doing Harm, which Dr. Reisner and our other colleagues with PHR released about 48 hours ago. We show in the now oft-cited case of quote-unquote rectal feeding, we show health professionals violating their responsibility to the patient, but also directly engaging in the design and infliction of techniques that were about causing harm and exerting control and had no medical value whatsoever. So in the case of rectal feeding, they're violating ethics, domestic law, and potentially international war crimes law, including, as we see with the human subjects experimentation evidence, potentially the Nuremberg Code.
Okay, what kind of experimentation was done on these detainees?
Well, basically, the United States government, in order to commit the crime of torture, it appears committed a second interlocked crime, and that was human subjects research. We see that they swallowed the spider to catch the fly, to use physicians and psychologists to collect data from detainees in order to mount a good faith defense and the Office of Legal Counsel memos that based on the opinions of the health professionals, they were not causing a level of severe and long-lasting physical and mental pain and suffering that would violate the Bush administration's interpretation of torture law.
Sure. While you're speaking, Stephen is actually grimacing out there in New York. Stephen, why are you grimacing so much? Share with us those dark thoughts in your head.
Yeah, well, what happens is that under the excuse of monitoring torture and preventing the tortures, the techniques from supposedly reaching the level of torture, which was the false legal rationale that was offered by the Justice Department, these doctors not only participated in torture, but they had to measure and judge what exactly the harm was likely to be. So in their zeal to protect the government against charges of torture, they actually committed an equally heinous crime, which was human subject research.
Give us an example, so spell that out for us, because this is territory that you know very well, but as lay people, civilians, we don't understand it as well as you do. So give us an example of how they would do that, how they would lay that out, saying, okay, well, this is okay, this is not going to hurt them too much, or just enough.
Well, just enough for what is the major question. So when you do waterboarding and you give a prisoner an experience of drowning so that they are afraid that they're about to die, you've violated the Convention Against Torture just by doing that. But what the doctors tried to do was to measure how much water, how much saline they needed to put in the water, what temperature the water should be, to permit them to do this technique, to do this form of torture in a way that didn't destroy the prisoner. You could even conjecture that they did it so that the prisoner would not be so debilitated that he wouldn't be able to be subject to more such techniques. So the whole idea of monitoring, calibrating, and recording and researching the torture and its effects violate a whole host of international laws, including the fact that they did research on these subjects in order to improve the way that the torture fit their protocols.
So there were a couple of those doctors that were involved in that report that were highlighted about their role. And we asked the community if their actions were perhaps justified, and we got the following reactions. We have Emmy here who tweeted in saying, as an ethicist, let me be the first to say no. Mitchell and Jessen should be jailed and the APA should be disbanded. And we have Mark Lance here who also tweeted, who commented on Facebook saying, the US ratified the UN Convention Against Torture. One doesn't have to look at specialized ethical responsibilities of medical professionals. They clearly leapt across the most obvious red lines and should all be in prison at The Hague. Steve, do you think that there's going to be any accountability for the things that have come out of the report?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I totally disagree with what was done here, and it was wrong in many respects. I do not see where there's going to be direct accountability for any of these people that were involved. But let me tell you what I think might happen. I think that at the highest levels of our government, and so as a retired Army officer and a retired Army general, I can see where behind closed doors there will be some real serious conversation and ways of looking back at what has occurred and occurred particularly 10 plus years ago, what lessons were learned, and what we need to do so it doesn't happen again. There's a couple things here that we should keep in mind at sort of the basic part of the conversation. First of all, torture is recognized by everyone as it is not an effective tactic or technique for good interrogations.
All right, Steve, but that seems to go against a lot of what's been happening in Guantanamo Bay, in black sites around the world. Are not people, detainees, being tortured?
They were tortured.
Yeah.
And it got out of hand, and people did things in a way that it violated our principles, violated the conventions we signed up to, but it never made sense that that we were going to get, and we could not confidently think that we were going to get good intelligence.
Right.
It did start off. It kicked off with these particular two psychologists who have now become, publics.
Yeah. So we've got James Mitchell and Bruce Jensen. Do you mind if I play a little bit of James Mitchell? He was on Fox News
I think
on
that's
Monday,
a good clip.
And he explains. This is James Mitchell here, the psychologist who was involved in this. Have a listen to him. This is from December the 15th.
You know, he's a human being. Those techniques are so harsh that it's emotionally distressing to the people who are administering them. But even though you don't want to do it, you're doing it in order to save lives in the country, and we would just have to man up, for lack of a better term.
So he's talking about their waterboarding Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and he's saying it wasn't easy, but he still went ahead and did it. How can you imagine a situation where that would actually happen?
No, I can't.
Really?
And because, remember what he said was, we do it for the defense of the country, which means we're doing it for intelligence. And there's no good science, and I take experienced interrogators, and you can ask Mark Fallon, they would say to you that we're going to get information that's useful. And nothing's come out that said we ever got any useful information.
Mark?
Yeah, let me give you some background on this, because I've been there since the onset. I've been working Al-Qaeda for a number of years prior to 9/11. And the real problem we had was the interrogation that was designed by the Central Intelligence Agency was not designed by interrogation professionals. Mitchell and Jensen had absolutely zero interrogation experience. They had experience in SEER, which is an interrogation resistance tactic. The CIA did not turn to experienced professionals who had been doing this for years, who had elicited accurate and reliable information from terrorist suspects in the past, and they went down their own. They did not listen to their own behavioral scientists and operational psychologists. They outsourced this. EITs was an excuse to inflict torture, and they used the medical profession to do so.
Tactics, right? So severe torture for most of us who are sort of lay people.
It was torture. It's a violation of the United States Code. It's a violation of the Convention Against Torture. It's a violation of Geneva Conventions, and it is just purely illegal.
So it's the medical bit of this that is really quite intriguing. The fact that doctors, medical professionals should be involved. Omar, what is our international community saying about this?
There's actually raising the question about whether there is this fundamental contradiction between the interests of the states and the obligations of doctors. So you have Zach here who says the duty of the state is to protect citizens, the duty of medical professionals is to first do no harms, and that limits the means available to the state to fulfill its duty by excluding any of those medical professionals in experiences such as torture.
Let me disagree with him on that. And I know I've heard that other times. As a military physician and officer, I subscribe to both those duties. I put the uniform on to defend the country against all enemies, foreign and domestic, to do what it needed to do to keep the country safe. Now, I did it to be the best medical officer I could be, because it is really important that our armed forces, their families, and the country at large be healthy and fit to do what it needs to do. What Mark Fallon just told you is the science behind this was totally shaky. And the way they went around doing this was sloppy. And so as a medical officer, the first step is to say, you're not accomplishing the mission. You're not keeping our country safe. And not only doing that, you're putting the physicians and the other healthcare providers you rely on in a bad situation that they've got to violate their ethics. And you don't want that to happen. You don't want the people that you want to go to, that you always want to feel safe about, that are going to help you. You don't want them to feel compromised.
So, Stephen, you've got skills as a psychologist. You've got skills that perhaps the CIA might be able to benefit from. Is there a role anywhere in counterterrorism for medical professionals with particular skills that may be able to help interrogate people?
Well, I think that the danger here, of course, is that yes, we have special skills. I'm a psychologist, so I understand what holds the human mind together, what makes it work best, and what can undermine it. But I am sworn, my ethical duty is not to use those skills to undermine the well-being of any individual human being. So yes, I could use my skills to help interrogators work to get information, help them learn how to get information in a way that doesn't do harm.
Can you give us an example, Stephen? How would you do that?
Well, psychologists do research on relationships and on what helps people to feel proud and comfortable and more likely to speak freely. And I think that a psychologist can give a class to interrogators on working with prisoners to tap their egos and develop a rapport with them so that they might find a way of having a conversation that gets intelligence from them. That's the way I think research shows best interrogations take place. But I believe that as a health professional, psychologists have no place in an individual interrogation with a specific prisoner.
Steve.
No, I think that's exactly right. So, I mean, there's a lot that psychology, medicine can give. So, to train interrogators, to build rapport, understand how these men think and how they kind of operate. But there's not a place for a care provider. There's a place for a specific psychologist who works as an interrogator to advise the people who are doing the questioning.
So what about if somebody gets so beaten up that they need a doctor? What does the doctor do?
Well, then the doctor treats them, and he says, and you have to report it. I mean, and and that's, I think, the obligation of anyone who's working in the area at the time. If you think that torture's occurred, someone's been abused, then the medical chain's got to report it all the way up and say, look, this breaks all our rules. We're not going to do this.
So they're beating up a detainee, they're waterboarding a detainee, the doctor comes in to treat the detainee, and then that doctor's supposed to report it. How terrified will that doctor be?
No, he's in a tough place.
Yeah.
There's no question. We're professionals. We're not children.
Right.
We took an oath. We're officers. And it means that our principles are in fact more important than our careers.
See, if everybody thought that, there would be no black sites and there'd be no torture and we would have no conversation. This is very idealistic. Omar.
Interestingly enough, there are some people in our community who actually disagree completely with this and see the doctors as having a positive role in these interrogations. We have Big Lysis here who tweeted in saying, when we asked whether doctors should have a role in interrogations, she said everyone must be involved in counterterrorism, and went on to saying it's a good thing that medical personnel are involved, otherwise the detainees will be killed because interrogators are not doctors. Nathaniel, I want to throw this to you. What do you say to people who argue that the presence of doctors there actually protects detainees?
This is an absolute false dilemma. The idea that there is somehow a operational utility to the health professional in these types of interrogations is entirely false. Looking at one of the best interrogation teams in the world in terms, and Mark can say more about this, in terms of the behavioral analysis unit at FBI, they don't train their personnel, including psychologists, in ticking bomb scenarios, and they don't train their personnel in torture. Why? Because it doesn't work, and secondly, because it undermines the mission. So the idea here that somehow by observing ethics, we're denying a critical national security capability from operational personnel is entirely a straw man. What we see from experts, and Mark can talk more about this, what we've seen from experts each step of the way is that health professionals, if you have an interrogation where you need a doctor, then you're doing it wrong.
Interesting. All right, let me bring in Mark then. Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I believe there's an absolute role for trained professional operational psychologists, and I'll give you a clear example of how it benefited us and benefited me. When I was given the order to investigate Al-Qaeda for trial before military commission, the task force we created, we relied on a behavioral science consultation team. And so what I was looking to do, and we were looking to do as a task force, is bring together the subject matter experts so the leadership can make the best decisions that are informed by science, that are informed by experience. So we brought together the chief operational psychologist from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, Dr. Mike Gellis, who I believe was the best in the business at the time. We brought together operational psychologists from the Air Force, OSI, people from the CIA, people from the Secret Service with experience there. We brought together a team to advise me. And so that team, as well as teams of lawyers and everyone else, when you're leading a task force, you are looking for every resource available to make an informed decision. So they helped inform and shape the decision-making processes that we made. They helped train our interrogators and investigators in the cultural aspects of interrogation. And I would never, ever advocate that they do an interrogation. It is not their role. They were an adjunct support.
I mean, this is a naive question, but I'm going to ask you anyway. In any of your interrogation, did any of the interrogation become physical? Did you need a doctor to help with a detainee after you'd finished interrogating?
No. That's the Hollywood version of an interrogation.
Or maybe the torture version that's featuring James Mitchell, who's been talking about this on Fox News, right?
Well,
that's not Hollywood.
You don't. Well, it's not Hollywood, but ask them what the basis for going down that road was. Ask them what evidence-based research would show you that the elicitation of pain would result in the acquisition of reliable and accurate information. Right. SEER tactics are designed to harden resistance, and that's exactly what they did. Look at the case studies of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, Abu Zubaydah, the people who this was done to. It hardened resistance, and it made it more difficult to elicit information.
All right, let me just play you one more clip. This is James Mitchell, the psychologist who was involved in torture with the CIA, and this is him on Monday talking to Fox News. Have a listen to this.
We didn't just go in there and start waterboarding Abu Zubaydah. We practiced. We got briefings from the medical people. We practiced the emergency responses that we were going to do. We went through where each person was going to be if there happened to be an emergency. And then, and only then, when we felt that we could do it safely without, causing permanent damage or violating the rules, we did it that way.
All right, so just a sentence, just go round Robin very quickly. Nathaniel, what should happen to James Mitchell and people like him?
He should be investigated, prosecuted, and if found guilty, he should serve time in federal prison.
Steve?
Look, I think the lessons learned here is that this was wrong, and we need to figure out, as Mark Fallon said, how is it that we put these people totally inexperienced in that position and put in the policies that it doesn't happen again.
All right, Stephen, literally a line. What should happen to James Mitchell and people like him?
Well, it seems to me that, his standard is basically if the detainee dies, he did something wrong. That's the argument that he's making. And I think that we certainly have to hold him accountable, put him on trial, investigate him for war crimes, but we also have to consider the entire culture of torture that seems to have spread through the CIA and came down from the administration. So if we're going to start talking about accountability, there's a lot of accountability here to go around.
I'm taking all of our guests to the post show, the fascinating guests, Mark Fallon, Nathaniel Raymond, Stephen Reisner and Steve Xenakis, all going to be at stream.aljazeera.com. Let me tell you about the next show. We need your help. Education is said to be an investment in your future, but are high costs deterring students? Now, across Europe, many are calling for free higher education, but critics say that the cost of quality schooling will suffer. Now, do you know somebody who'd be great on that show? Is that person you? Who can talk about higher education and how much it should cost? Tweet us, #AJStream. See you soon. Hello again, this is the Stream's online post show. We're talking about the relationship between doctors and counterterrorism in light of the recent CIA so-called torture report findings. So let's get right back to that conversation. I was really intrigued as to what Mark would say about what should happen to people like James Mitchell. He's just one of the people that we found out about, Mark. There must be many more people that we have no clue are doing similar things, right?
Well, you know, the darkness is starting to be illuminated. Mitchell and Jensen did grave damage to our national security. I mean, they made our country less safe, and the practices that were enabled through them are just shameful. I mean, they were a stain on the honor of the United States, and somebody needs to be accountable. Not just them, but who turned to them? Why didn't they even turn to their own people within the CIA who were against what they were doing?
Do you think they were just mavericks? Do you think, you know, in any organization there are always going to be a couple of people who would just maybe cross the line? Well,
I mean, was that to me?
Yeah, to Mark, but I know Nathaniel has something to say. So Mark, you go ahead first, and then Nathaniel jump in just when Mark wraps up.
I mean, these policies were bred from fear, and they were designed by people with a high degree of ignorance about what really happened in an interrogation and how to elicit information, and I'm afraid to say quite a degree of arrogance to think that they would be able to design a program without going to subject matter experts and people who've done this and just wing it when our national security was at stake. So I think there needs to be some degree of accountability, and certainly the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence has identified that, and anyone who reads this report would just be aghast at what government employees would do who have sworn an oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States, because it was clearly illegal what was going on.
Nathaniel, so when I said, do you think they were just mavericks, you made a noise. Why did you make a noise? Were you snorting?
This regime of torture was command authorized at the highest level. We know that. The Department of Justice, on orders from the White House, was involved in drafting a legal heat shield that relied on health professionals to serve as a get-out-jail-free card. The Bush administration has clearly authorized and owned this program. So there's no question of whether they were mavericks. The second issue, and I want to make sure I make this point to individuals like Mark Fallon and others in law enforcement and FBI, NCIS, without you, we wouldn't be here today. The earliest whistleblowers, the earliest dissenters were our men and women in the law enforcement community who saw this, reported this, and tried to do their job, which was enforcing the law. And one last sentence here, which is basically, there's a broader issue of accountability. For the past decade, we basically had a war between the intelligence community and law enforcement over these tactics and accountability for them. And I think if anyone needs an answer about whether these are appropriate for our country, you need to look at patriots like Mark Fallon, like Ali Safwan, like Del Spry and FBI, who stood up to this and said, no, this is not what we do. This is against the law.
So there's a question that's coming up in our community about whether doctors are discouraged from this kind of thing in the first place. We have Hafsa here who tweeted in saying, as a medical student, I can't understand. The first thing we're taught in school is do no harm. They completely disregarded that. Steve, do you get the sense that this is something that is emphasized in medical school everywhere? I mean, is there sufficient emphasis on taking ethics seriously and what things you can and can't do in your profession?
There's a lot being done in the medical curriculum on ethics, and there's specific courses. I've taught in several medical schools, and I think more needs to be done. I mean, because I think that our young doctors are placed in tough situations often, not just here, but lots of times just in the normal course of their practice, where they've got to make decisions about what the managed care company, the insurer says, and what they think's right for the patient. Yeah. So I think we've got some more work to do, and we should emphasize it. And I think this is the kind of circumstance that brings it to light, because this is what you were saying before, Femi. How do you stand up when you're right there in the situation? How do you stand up, and how do you make your voice effective at the time, knowing that there might be consequences?
So how would you do that if you were in that situation? You were on a black site, you were told to do something that you didn't want to do, that was unethical, then what?
I mean, so when I've been in those situations,
Right.
I've said, no, I'm not doing this. You can't order me. If you order me, it's illegal. I know the regulation, and I know you know that I know I can go all the way up the chain, including through the Inspector General chain, and this is going to get really messy. Don't push me.
Right.
It's also important in this light, not only what students are taught in school, but what the professional associations make clear are the ethical principles that all professionals have to abide by, so that when a soldier is faced with an illegal or unethical order, the soldier can say, the psychologist, the physician can say, it is widely known that my professional ethical principles forbid me to do this. My professional association will back me up on this, and the chain of command should have policy consistent with the ethical principles of the major associations of the United States.
All right, Stephen, is that happening?
Well, unfortunately, the major associations have not been 100% consistent and clear about prohibiting psychologists from being involved in these kinds of interrogations.
That is a very diplomatic answer. What do you really mean by that?
Specifically, the medical associations prohibit it outright, but have yet to hold anybody accountable for countervening those ethical principles.
So here's
the
an
American
here's an interesting thing to be added. Look, we all apply for our licenses, renew them every 2 or 3 years, and there's a set of about, depending on the state, 12, 15 questions. You know, have you been convicted of a felony? Have you had a problem with drug or alcohol abuse? None of those state licensure boards ask, have you ever participated in torture or been accused of participating in torture or abuse?
Yeah, yeah.
And it is, I think that the citizens of every state should be concerned about it. Do they want to go to a doctor or a psychologist or somebody else who has done these kinds of things?
You're trying to give us nightmares, Steve. Nobody's sleeping tonight.
Well, look, it's built my practice.
I mean, this is actually precisely the suggestion that is being brought up by our community. We have KB here who tweeted in saying, healthcare professionals took an oath to do no harm. They need to uphold this or have their licenses revoked at the very least. And we have Hamza here who also says, how can siding with torturers ever be justified in the medical profession? They should be stripped of their license to practice. Nathaniel, do you think this is the sort of thing where you could see public pressure maybe applied on the medical establishment to hold these people accountable if the law won't hold them accountable?
Well, I'll kick this over to Dr. Reisner. We've been working for years to change the policies of the American Psychological Association, and which is right now under independent investigation for alleged collusion with the CIA in the torture program. So there's two tracks here. One is, yes, there needs to be changes to state law, which our colleagues are working on in New York, Massachusetts, and elsewhere, and federal law. But the second is that in the case of the APA, the association itself needs to be investigated and held to account. And Dr. Reisner can say more about that.
Well, I personally tried to bring a psychologist who was accused of torture up on ethics charges in the state of New York, and a number of people did it in other states, including bringing Mitchell and Jessen up when they were licensed. I think Jessen is still licensed. I think Mitchell is retired. But no state board would complete an investigation. And the American Psychological Association has basically refused to open a full ethics investigation for any of the psychologists who were members of the APA who were accused of participating in torture.
We asked them for a statement.
APA has a...
Stephen, we asked the APA about this specifically, and they were going to come on, then they weren't going to come on, then they gave us this statement. So he said, if the allegations are true about Mitchell and Jessen, the psychologists who have been mentioned in the CIA torture report, the 2 psychologists involved in the torture program should be held accountable for serious violations of human rights and US and international law. They kind of put their stake out there. That's unequivocal, right?
They did that. They can say that because Mitchell and Jessen are no longer members of the American Psychological Association.
Okay,
so
all right.
The American Psychological Association isn't responsible for holding them accountable.
All right.
However, there are members of the APA who have been accused of being involved who have not been investigated by the Ethics Committee. So yes, I think that the APA has a much further way to go.
Okay.
And right now, they're being investigated for this refusal. On the one hand, they're being investigated because of allegations that they colluded with the CIA.
All right, Stephen, I'm going to ask you to finish up this thought because I'm in the last minute of the show and I need to hear the end of your story in like 20 seconds. Go ahead. 20
seconds. They're being investigated because it looks like they may have changed their own ethics policy to fit the requirements, the desires of the CIA and the White House.
And then he starts a whole new conversation right there. Stephen, Steve, Nathaniel, and Mark, thank you so much. This is a fascinating conversation, a very disturbing one. We really appreciate you bringing your expertise here to us on AJ Stream. Let me tell you very quickly about the next show. Now, should higher education be free? Across Europe, many are calling for free schooling, but critics say the quality of education may suffer. What is the best solution? If you have an idea or a guest idea, tweet us, #AJStream. See you back here next time.